For the first 10 years of our marriage, I believed Megan and I had something unshakable. We had built a life that wasn't flashy but felt deeply fulfilling. Megan was a small-town girl who worked as a community coordinator for a local nonprofit, and I was a regional sales manager for a construction firm. Between raising our two boys, Ryan and Connor, and keeping up with our mortgage, we were busy, but happy. Or so I thought. It started with an invitation. Megan told me her organization had been offered a major grant by a wealthy donor named Patrick, who owns several properties in town. She explained that he wanted to meet with her personally to discuss how the funds would be used. She was excited, and I couldn't blame her. She had worked tirelessly on community projects, and this was her chance to secure something big. Patrick wasn't just any donor. He was a figure in our town, known for his lavish parties and expensive taste. He owned a sprawling estate on the outskirts, complete with a private vineyard and an art collection that drew occasional media attention. Megan described him as charming but a bit eccentric. I joked that he sounded like someone straight out of a movie, the kind of character who swoops in to save the day. The first meeting seemed to go well. Megan came home that evening glowing, talking about how Patrick was deeply interested in her ideas for revitalizing a local youth center. She said he had promised additional support if she could provide a comprehensive plan. But something about her excitement felt different, not just pride or enthusiasm, but something else I couldn't place. Over the next few weeks, Megan's involvement with Patrick grew. She started spending more evenings at his estate, saying she was hammering out details for the youth center. At first, I supported her wholeheartedly. This was the kind of opportunity she had worked toward for years. But little things started to bother me. Megan began dressing differently when she went to meet him, more formal, more polished than usual. She mentioned Patrick's vineyard tours and wine tastings in passing, saying they were part of his creative brainstorming sessions. One Friday night, I received a call from Connor's teacher, reminding me about a parent-teacher conference Megan had promised to attend. When I mentioned it to her later, she apologized, saying Patrick had kept her late discussing contracts. She promised to make the next one, but the moment stuck with me. Megan rarely forgot important dates with the boys. It was Ryan, our eldest, who unknowingly set off the first real alarm. One evening, as I was helping him with homework, he mentioned overhearing Megan on a call. He said she was laughing in a way that didn't sound like her usual laugh. When I asked what she was laughing about, he shrugged and said, "I think she was talking to that guy from the big house." The comment stayed with me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. She'd never given me a reason not to trust her, but the unease grew. One night, as we were lying in bed, I asked her how things were going with Patrick. She launched into a detailed explanation of his plans for the youth center, but her tone felt rehearsed, as if she were trying to convince me of something. I let it go, but the doubt lingered. The next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Megan's phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen out of habit and saw Patrick's name pop up. The message preview read, "Looking forward to our weekend meeting. Hope you're ready for some fun." My stomach dropped. I didn't touch the phone, didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at it, as the coffee maker gurgled in the background. Megan walked in a few minutes later, kissed me on the cheek, and grabbed her phone without a second glance. She smiled as she read the message, her thumb moving quickly across the screen to type a reply. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to know how deep it went. This wasn't just about the youth center anymore. It wasn't just about work. It was something far more personal. As the days passed, the message from Patrick continued to gnaw at me. I tried to convince myself it was innocent. Maybe he was just a charming guy who didn't understand boundaries. But the doubt wouldn't go away. Every time I saw Megan's phone in her hand or caught her glancing at it with a small smile, my mind spiraled into questions I didn't want to answer. One evening, while Megan was at another late meeting, I found myself pacing the house. The boys were upstairs, lost in their video games, and the silence in the living room felt oppressive. I couldn't shake the sense that something was slipping away from me, something I couldn't name but could feel in every quiet moment. In an attempt to distract myself, I started tidying up her home office, a space she guarded fiercely but rarely kept organized. As I sorted through scattered papers and notes, I came across a stack of invitations for Patrick's events. One of them caught my eye, a private dinner he had hosted 2 weeks earlier, On the same night, Megan had told me she was working late at the nonprofit office. My chest tightened as I stared at the ornate card. I had assumed these events were strictly professional, but the description on the invitation was different. An exclusive evening for close collaborators. Celebrate creativity and connection. It sounded less like a business dinner and more like something personal. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I remembered Megan mentioning that Patrick had taken photos of the youth center renovations for his social media, so I searched for his public accounts. What I found was a curated stream of wealth and indulgence. Vintage cars, exotic vacations, and endless photos of his sprawling estate. Buried among the posts was a candid photo from the private dinner I had seen on the invitation. It showed a long table set with crystal glasses and flickering candles. Guests were laughing, their faces glowing in the warm light. And there was Megan, sitting beside Patrick, her head tilted toward him as he whispered something in her ear. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. She looked happy, comfortable, as if she belonged in that world. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to confront her outright. Instead, I tried to watch for signs, hoping to catch some glimpse of the truth without tipping my hand. Megan came home late, as usual, and headed straight to the shower. While she was upstairs, I noticed her bag lying on the counter. My hands moved before I could think. I unzipped the bag and rifled through it, my pulse racing. At the bottom, beneath her planner and some loose papers, I found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, the kind she would have worn proudly if it were from me. My heart sank as I held it, the tag still attached, showing it was from an upscale jewelry store. When Megan came downstairs, I asked her casually how her day had been. She smiled and said it was productive, her tone breezy. I wanted to ask her about the bracelet, but something stopped me. Instead, I nodded, pretending to accept her words, and went to bed with the weight of the pouch pressing against my chest. The next morning, I called my brother, Chris. I hadn't told him much about what was going on, but I needed someone to help me make sense of things. He listened carefully as I described the dinner photo, the bracelet, and the message from Patrick. Chris didn't sugarcoat his thoughts. He said it sounded like Megan had crossed a line, even if I didn't have hard proof. He told me I needed to figure out how far this had gone before making any decisions. Hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself I was overthinking, but now there was no denying that something was wrong. That evening, as Megan chatted with the boys over dinner, I found myself watching her every move. She laughed at Ryan's jokes, teased Connor about his messy hair, and carried on like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The person sitting across from me wasn't just my wife anymore. She was a puzzle I couldn't solve, a mystery I wasn't sure I wanted to unravel. Still, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own. The following weekend, Megan surprised me with an invitation to a charity gala hosted by Patrick. She claimed it was essential for her nonprofit's visibility, a way to network with potential donors. At first, I hesitated. Attending an event in Patrick's world felt like stepping onto foreign soil, shiny and opulent, a far cry from the life we'd built. But something about the way Megan pitched it made me curious. I agreed to go, determined to understand what had drawn her so deeply into this circle. The evening of the gala, Megan spent hours getting ready, her focus entirely on her appearance. She asked me for my opinion on her dress, a sleek black gown that seemed more suited for a red carpet than a fundraiser. I told her she looked beautiful, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. When we arrived at the venue, a sprawling mansion lit up like a jewel, I felt the weight of eyes on us immediately. The crowd was a mix of influencers, business elites, and artists, all sipping champagne and exchanging smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Megan navigated the room with ease, introducing me to people I had only heard about in passing. But it wasn't long before Patrick appeared, larger than life in his tailored suit and confident grin. He greeted Megan with familiarity, clasping her hand a second longer than necessary. Patrick turned to me, extending his hand. He spoke warmly, complimenting Megan's work and praising her dedication. But there was something in his tone, a subtle edge, that made my skin crawl. As the evening went on, Megan drifted away, caught up in conversations with Patrick and his guests. I tried to follow along, but the discussions felt like a game I didn't know the rules to. Instead, I found myself talking to a bartender who shared a tidbit that made my stomach tighten. He mentioned how Patrick had a reputation for being generous with his collaborators, especially women. It was common knowledge among the staff that Patrick's private meetings were anything but professional. I thanked him, my smile tight, and excused myself to find Megan. I spotted her in a small lounge off the main hall, deep in conversation with Patrick and a few others. Her laugh rang out, louder than I'd heard in months, and her hand rested lightly on his arm. My chest tightened as I stood in the doorway, torn between stepping in and walking away. Before I could decide, another guest approached me. It was a woman I recognized from earlier, a journalist named Rebecca who had asked sharp questions during dinner. She introduced herself and wasted no time getting to the point. She said Patrick's galas were famous for their glittering facade, but often concealed something darker. She spoke in riddles at first, alluding to rumors about his relationships with married collaborators. Then she asked me a question that hit like a brick. Have you ever wondered what really keeps her so busy? My face must have given me away because Rebecca softened her tone. She said she didn't mean to upset me, but felt it was fair to know who Patrick really was. When she walked away, my resolve hardened. Whatever was happening between Megan and Patrick, I wasn't going to wait in the shadows any longer. The night wasn't just a charity gala. It was a curtain pulled back on a world Megan had entered without me, and I was determined to uncover what lay behind it. The ride home from the gala was suffocating. Megan was glowing, her energy vibrant in a way I hadn't seen in months. She gushed about how successful the evening had been, how Patrick's connections were going to open doors for her projects. But her words barely registered. My thoughts were stuck on Rebecca's warning, on Patrick's hand lingering too long on Megan's back, on the easy familiarity in their laughter. When we got home, Megan went straight to bed, exhausted from the night's excitement. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass she'd left on the coffee table. My chest felt heavy, a mix of anger and humiliation boiling inside me. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Not about the gala, but about the shifts I'd been noticing for months. I asked her directly why she was so distant lately, why her world seemed to revolve around Patrick and his events. Her reaction caught me off guard. Instead of answering, Megan snapped at me, accusing me of being paranoid and unsupportive. She said I didn't understand what it took to build something meaningful, that I couldn't handle her success. Her words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. But what hurt most was the venom in her voice, the way she looked at me like I was the one ruining everything. Later that week, I decided to dig deeper. Patrick was too polished, too confident. If there was more to him, I was going to find it. I reached out to Rebecca. She seemed surprised but willing to talk. Over coffee, she shared what she'd uncovered about Patrick in her years as a journalist. She said Patrick was known for preying on vulnerable people, particularly women with potential but limited resources. He used his wealth and influence to draw them in, making them feel special and indispensable. But there was always a cost. Rebecca said she'd seen marriages crumble because of Patrick's manipulations, and she warned me to be careful. She said if Megan was involved with him, it wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated move on his part. Her words lit a fire in me. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. Patrick was pulling strings, and Megan was caught in his web. That evening, I told Megan I'd spoken to someone about Patrick. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused me of spying on her, of trying to control her life. She called me insecure, saying I was threatened by her independence and success. When I mentioned Rebecca's warning, Megan laughed bitterly. She said Rebecca was just jealous, that she'd been trying to take Patrick down for years. The argument spiraled out of control. Megan's words became cruel, her insults landing with precision. She said Patrick treated her like she mattered, unlike me, who was too wrapped up in my own insecurities to see her for who she really was. I felt something break inside me. I told her I wasn't blind, that I'd seen the way she looked at him, the way she acted when she thought I wasn't watching. I told her I knew there was more to their relationship than work. Her response was a sharp, mocking laugh. "What if there is?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I left the house that night, driving aimlessly until I found myself parked in a deserted lot. My thoughts raced, anger and heartbreak crashing over me in waves. I realized then that this wasn't just about Patrick. It was about Megan, about who she'd become. And it was about me, about how much I was willing to endure before finally walking away. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. If Patrick thought he could manipulate my wife, if Megan thought she could rewrite the rules of our marriage without consequences, they were both about to learn how wrong they were. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the explosive argument, Megan acted as though nothing had happened. She moved through the house with an unsettling calm, preparing breakfast for the boys and chatting with them as if our marriage wasn't hanging by a thread. I watched her from across the room, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The woman who sat with our kids, smiling and laughing, wasn't the same person I had faced the night before. That version of her, with her sharp tongue and cold eyes, lingered in my mind like a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't a dream, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into thinking it was. That afternoon, I drove to Patrick's estate. It was a risky move, but I needed to see him in his element. I told myself it wasn't about confronting him. It was about understanding the kind of man who had come between us. When I arrived, the gate was open, and a few cars were parked in the long, winding driveway. I lingered near the entrance, my hands gripping the wheel as I debated whether to go in. But before I could make a decision, I saw Megan. She was walking toward the house with Patrick at her side. They were deep in conversation, her face animated as she gestured with her hands. Patrick leaned in, saying something that made her laugh. A soft, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in months. It felt like a punch to the gut. That evening, I called my brother, Chris. I needed someone to ground me, someone who could help me make sense of everything. Chris listened quietly as I told him about the gala, Rebecca's warning, and what I'd seen at Patrick's estate. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, he told me that Megan wasn't the only one responsible for what was happening. He said Patrick was a predator, a manipulator who thrived on exploiting vulnerabilities. But he also said that if Megan was choosing to engage with him, then she was making a choice to prioritize Patrick over our family. His words hit hard, but they gave me the clarity I needed. The next day, I took action. I reached out to Rebecca again, asking her if she had anything concrete on Patrick. She hesitated at first, saying her research was still ongoing, but eventually, she shared a lead. Patrick had been tied to several financial scandals over the years, most of which had been quietly settled out of court. She suggested I start there, looking for a pattern that might shed light on his true intentions. I spent hours that night combing through articles and public records, piecing together a picture of a man who used his wealth and charm to manipulate those around him. But it wasn't just Patrick's past that unsettled me. It was the realization that Megan might have been pulled into something far bigger than she understood. When Megan came home late again that night, I confronted her calmly. I asked her where she had been, and for once, she hesitated. She stumbled over her words, trying to paint her evening as another work-related meeting, but her story was riddled with holes. When I mentioned Patrick's scandals, her expression shifted. She became defensive, accusing me of digging into things that didn't concern me. But there was something else in her eyes, fear. It was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, I wondered if Megan wasn't just being selfish or reckless. What if Patrick wasn't just an affair but a trap she couldn't see a way out of? The thought sent a chill down my spine. That night, as I lay awake, I realized I was no longer fighting to save our marriage. I was fighting to uncover the truth about Patrick, about Megan, and about what had led us to this breaking point. I wasn't sure where it would end, but I knew I couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. After my heated argument with Megan, I realized I couldn't untangle this mess on my own. Rebecca, sensing the urgency of the situation, suggested that we approach it differently, not by trying to confront Patrick directly, but by exposing the vulnerabilities in his empire. Rebecca reached out to a small group of individuals who had experience dealing with Patrick: former employees, business partners, and one particularly scorned investor. These people had no loyalty to Patrick and every reason to see him brought down. Our first meeting was in a quiet cafe. Rebecca introduced me to a woman named Karen, a former event coordinator who had worked under Patrick for several years. Karen explained that she had been dazzled by Patrick's charm at first. He had offered her lucrative contracts, invitations to high-profile events, and promises of advancement. But as time went on, she realized his generosity came with strings attached. Patrick had a way of isolating people, pulling them into his world while subtly alienating them from their own. He encouraged Karen to cancel plans with her family, to prioritize his needs over her own, and eventually, to compromise her values for the sake of the vision. When she finally broke away, she was left with nothing. Her reputation tarnished, her finances in shambles, and a lingering bitterness that fueled her desire for justice. As Karen spoke, I couldn't help but see parallels to what Megan was experiencing. The late nights, the distancing, the growing fixation on Patrick and his world. It all fit. Rebecca's network grew. By the end of the week, we had spoken with a handful of people who had similar stories. One man, Andrew, described Patrick as a master manipulator, someone who preyed on weaknesses and exploited vulnerabilities. He said Patrick's real talent wasn't in business but in reading people, knowing exactly how to make them feel special, indispensable, and trapped. Andrew's story hit close to home. He said Patrick had ruined his marriage by deliberately sowing discord between him and his wife. Patrick had framed himself as a confidant, offering advice and support, while subtly encouraging Andrew's wife to see him as the better option. "She didn't leave me for him," Andrew said, his voice bitter. But by the time she realized what he was doing, we were already broken. His words sent a chill through me. Was that Patrick's goal? To break us completely, leaving Megan dependent on him? Meanwhile, Megan's behavior became more erratic. She was away more often than ever, her explanations vague and unconvincing. One night, as we sat in the living room, she mentioned an upcoming weekend retreat at Patrick's estate. She said it was mandatory, a chance for the team to recharge and align their vision. I asked her if the boys and I could come along, framing it as a family outing. Megan's response was immediate and sharp. She said it wasn't appropriate, that it was a professional event. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Rebecca and I decided to act during that weekend retreat. She had gathered enough material from Karen and Andrew, emails, photos, and testimonies that painted a clear picture of Patrick's manipulations. We planned to confront Megan with the truth, not to accuse her, but to show her what kind of man Patrick really was. On the morning of the retreat, I watched Megan pack her bags, her demeanor calm and composed. She kissed the boys goodbye, promising to call every night, and left without a second glance. As her car disappeared down the driveway, I felt the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about saving my marriage. It was about pulling Megan out of a trap she didn't even realize she was in. And I had one chance to get it right. 2 days after Megan left for the retreat, Rebecca sent me a message asking if we could meet. Her tone was more serious than usual, and I could feel the tension even through the screen. I agreed to meet her at a quiet diner later that evening. When I arrived, she wasted no time, sliding her phone across the table toward me. She said she had been following Patrick's movements during the retreat, trying to gather more evidence. What she stumbled upon, she said, was something she hadn't expected. On the screen was a video. I hesitated, my stomach churning as I hit play. The video was shaky, filmed from a distance through what looked like a curtain of trees. It showed Patrick's estate, its large glass windows glowing faintly in the evening light. Inside, Megan and Patrick were unmistakable. They were in the middle of an embrace, their movements leaving no doubt about what was happening. My chest tightened as I watched, anger and heartbreak crashing over me in waves. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that everything I had fought to salvage was already gone. Rebecca's voice cut through my thoughts. She said this was the last piece of the puzzle, the final proof that would dismantle Patrick's carefully constructed empire. She suggested releasing all the materials, emails, testimonies, financial evidence, and now the video, to the public. Once exposed, Patrick would have no place to hide, and law enforcement would be forced to act. I nodded, my mind spinning. If Megan wanted to align herself with Patrick, she could share the fallout with him. The following day, Rebecca published everything. She sent the materials to major media outlets, ensuring Patrick's name was plastered across every news site and social feed. The video wasn't included. It was too personal for public consumption, but everything else painted a damning picture of corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power. The backlash was immediate. Patrick's name became synonymous with scandal, his connections abandoning him in droves. Within hours, investigative reporters and government agencies began digging into his financial dealings and personal relationships. I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my living room, the boys playing upstairs, blissfully unaware of the chaos their mother was now entangled in. Megan returned home later that evening. She walked through the door with a bright smile, her face glowing from the weekend. But her expression faltered as she noticed the tension in the air. She asked me what was wrong, her voice hesitant. I told her to check her phone. It didn't take long for her to see the headlines. Her face drained of color as she scrolled through the articles, her hands trembling. She muttered something about how Patrick had assured her this would never happen, how he was too powerful to be brought down. I told her that Patrick wasn't the only one at fault. I reminded her of the choices she had made, the lies she had told, and the family she had pushed aside for his promises. Tears welled in her eyes as she apologized, her voice breaking. She said she had been blind, that she'd let herself get swept up in Patrick's world without realizing what it was doing to us. But her words felt hollow. When I pulled out my phone and showed her the video Rebecca had sent me, her reaction changed. She froze, her face pale, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming out. I told her I had seen enough, that there was nothing left to save. Her tears came fast, her apologies desperate now, but I couldn't feel anything but emptiness. I told her the marriage was over, that the trust she had shattered could never be rebuilt. The boys came downstairs, their laughter filling the room, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. Megan wiped her face quickly, trying to compose herself, but the damage was done. I told her she needed to leave. The next few weeks were chaotic. Megan stayed with a friend while I started the divorce proceedings. The kids were confused and hurt, but I tried to shield them from the worst of it. As for Patrick, his empire crumbled. The investigations uncovered layers of fraud and misconduct, and he was eventually arrested. Megan's apology letters came often in the beginning, but I couldn't bring myself to read them. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. In the end, I realized that betrayal wasn't just about the act. It was about the choices that led up to it, the moments where trust was eroded piece by piece. Megan's infidelity had destroyed our marriage, but it had also given me clarity. I wasn't going to spend another moment clinging to something that had already fallen apart.